The Exorcist is generally considered the scariest horror film ever made, and sometimes even the greatest horror film period. It was roundly condemned by many Christians as something that was satanic. Even the greatest preacher of the last 100 years, Billy Graham, roundly condemned the film and said the devil was in every frame. But Catholics have generally been a lot more supportive of it. What's my take on the subject?
I respect Billy Graham greatly, but he's wrong about this film. Not only is this film not satanic, but in fact it is clearly a Christian film that better than any other shows the battle between good and evil, God and the devil. To me, most people who condemned it never even bothered to watch the film, and those that did completely missed the point the film was trying to make. The film was a phenomenon. I wish I could have lived to see it when it first came out. People in the theaters were documented to have fainted, there was vomiting, there was a miscarriage, and some even claimed they were possessed after watching the film. As for me, I am a Christian who has read the entire Bible, but I'm not going to be speaking in tongues anytime soon, and I'm actually very skeptical about most spiritual things. Personally, I think the only people who were possessed by this film were those that were already diseased in the mind to begin with, the only demons they suffer from being the ones they already carried with them. It was mass hysteria. I'm not going to go over the film's great makeup effects or the iconic scenes like the subliminal face that shows up in split seconds where you're not even sure you saw it, or the infamous spider walk, or that crucifix scene. This video will be long enough already. I love how the film tricks you by showing the so-called hero, the Exorcist Father Merrin, only in the first 10 minutes, where he finds an ancient idol, which is a representation of the demon we'll see later in the film, and at the climax at the end. It really builds up anticipation for him. The real hero of the film is actually the struggling priest, Father Karras, who is losing his faith after the death of his mother. He is asked by the faithless mother of the girl who's possessed to exorcise her daughter, even though she doesn't believe in God, because she has tried everything else and has no other choice. He then has to do battle with a being he's not even sure he believes in anymore. Eventually, he is forced to faith, but he's clearly over his head, so he calls in an old exorcist who did battle with this same demon as a young man in Africa. C.S. Lewis once said that the two worst ways to treat the devil is to either believe in him too strongly or to not believe in him at all. Both are in evidence in this film. The film was written by William Peter Blatty, a devout Catholic who oddly enough made a living as a comedy writer before tackling this deadly serious subject. He also wrote the book it's based off of. It was said to have been loosely based on a true story about a possessed boy in St. Louis. The sex of the sufferer was changed for the film. The film was made in an extremely secular world, where on one hand you had atheists saying God was dead, while on the other end of the spectrum you had the New Age movement and occult pagan revivals. The old-time religion, meanwhile, was declining. The author stated he wanted to revive faith in an increasingly godless world. The mother in the film is an agnostic, if not all-out atheist. The little girl gets possessed by a demon she calls Captain Howdy, who she meets through a Ouija board. The film's message is clear. At the end, the older exorcist dies of a heart attack during the exorcism. It's left to Father Karras to save the girl. He finally accepts that since there is clearly a devil, there must also be a God. And he decides to invite the devil into himself, sacrificing himself for the sake of the girl, and then jumping out the window to his death, making himself a Christ-like sacrifice. The comparison is no accident. The film isn't perfect. For one thing, I find the long sections where they try to find a rational explanation to be rather tedious, but overall the film's length is justified, and the music behind the film is interesting. The classic spooky tune, Tubular Bells, wasn't actually written for the film, and contrary to popular belief, it wasn't the theme song either, but it somehow has become just that in popular opinion. The original song was discarded, and the director took a snippet of the huge epic composition, Tubular Bells, by progressive rocker Mike Oldfield. The actual song is over 20 minutes long, but the piece used for the film is only around 3 minutes. The guy who made it never meant for it to be scary, and he is said to have never actually seen the movie himself because it was, quote, too scary. Is it still the scariest movie ever made? Well, what's scary is subjective. For instance, the scene with the twin girls in The Shining is said to be one of the scariest scenes in movie history, but it did nothing for me personally. Did this film scare me? Honestly, no. But I know other people who suffered nightmares from this film. It's all in the mind of the beholder. I do think the film's power has been diluted somewhat with time. I personally respect it more than I love it. And it really says something when a film that was so terrifying people went hysterical is now shown year-round on common cable television. Something that would never happen with, say, Cannibal Holocaust or Salo. But the film is iconic for a reason, and despite the profanity and the vulgarity which was required to tell the story right, it is every bit as Christian as films like God's Not Dead. It just took a different route to spread its message. The shock factor of the film was every bit as necessary as the graphic violence and the Passion of the Christ. So if you're a Christian, watch it. You won't go to hell. In fact, this film is a great reminder that even in this age of science, there is still a God to call on in times of trouble. If I had to rank the greatest Christian movies of all time, my list would include The Ten Commandments, Ben-Hur, The Passion of the Christ, and The Last Temptation of Christ, though I admit that one is controversial for such a list. And yes, The Exorcist would also be on that list too.
Happy Easter.